Good morning and welcome to UPN Focus. I'm your host, Milt Thompson. We've got a show today, a little different than some of the others, but we're going to talk with my old good friend, Steve Kirsh, who is probably the preeminent, well not probably, the preeminent adoption lawyer here in the state of Indiana, here in Indianapolis. And he's brought along a special friend of his who's worked with him for some period of time, and that is Rhonda Schwindt, and she is a birth mother. And we're going to get a little more depth and detail about that throughout this show. Steve, welcome to UPN Focus.
Thank you, Milton. Thanks for having us.
We go so far back. I think 35 years ago. The only difference is you still look good, and I'm just fatter. But all that said,
did we go to grade school together?
We went to grade school together
Yeah.
a long time ago. Yet, same time, I look up professionally and look down the end of the hallway. Actually, on the same floor, we end up really in the same building. Quasi practicing law. You're actually doing the real thing. But your expertise and tracking that expertise in the world of adoption, kind of give us a little sense of where you came from to what you do today.
Well, I started practicing law 21 years ago. We went to law school together too. And about 10 minutes into the practice of law, I realized that this is really not what they made it out to be in law school. In fact, I handled one divorce, and I thought, that's all I need to do with that.
No one having to do with that anymore.
No, we don't need to do those anymore. I was deputy prosecutor for a while, and I just, like a young lawyer, I specialized in anything that paid a fee, and really wasn't terribly satisfied with that. And a dear friend of mine, he and his wife wanted to adopt, and I set about trying to find a baby for them, and I knew nothing. I mean, it was scary how little I knew at the time. But one thing led to another, and they got pregnant without me.
so much for your help.
Yeah, and I don't even think I billed them for that one. But I did start getting some phone calls because I had spread the word I was looking for, to help my friend, and everyone didn't know that my friend had already been successful. So I handled my first adoption. I thought, wow, this is amazing. I mean, this is something where I can get up in the morning, look at myself in the mirror and think, I did something really good today. Everyone benefits from the process. Certainly the adoptive parents do. They have a baby they couldn't otherwise have. But the birth mother gets a good solution to a difficult problem, and we know that the baby's going to have a good home. So, after the first one, I was hooked. Now, at the time, I had a law partner who is now a Court of Appeals judge, Judge Friedlander. And I remember going to his office after my third or fourth adoption, and I said, Zeke, this is what I want to do full time. He said, well, how many do you do a year? And I said, I think I did 2 last year.
It's okay, full time? That's not going to keep that fee paid.
He said, you're going to have to charge a lot. And it was just something I set my mind to. And in 1985 or so, I think I handled maybe 15 adoptions for the year. And I was in hog heaven. That's more adoption I'd ever handled in my previous law career all combined. The next year I went to like 34, and then from 34 adoptions I went into the 80s and into the 100, and my brother Joel joined me a few years later, and this is what we do.
If there are agencies out there that are called adoption agencies, where's the practice of law come into this entire process?
In Indiana, there's 2 different approaches to handle an adoption. One is through an adoption agency, and another is through an adoption attorney. The laws in Indiana are exactly the same for both agencies and attorneys. It's just a matter of preference for some people. And I think that Rhonda considered using an adoption agency. She'll let us know here in a minute, but she might be able to give you some insight into what kind of influenced her to go one way or the other.
Okay, well, before we do that, I want to try to kind of build our case a little bit about what this whole practice is all about, and how one would go about accessing your kinds of services and advice that they're looking for. But generally, people that are out there that may either have an unwanted pregnancy and/or someone who is looking to get pregnant and don't have the ability to do so, but yet are very interested in children. Where do they start? Who do they call? He'll call you right away. But
55, 55.
And once they call you,
did you get that number? 317-575-55.
I tell you, this Steve Kirsh guy, I tell you, now we know we go way, way back. The process. What do you explain? Are the possibilities, the timing for those kinds of things? I know there are going to be a whole situation with international adoptions and out-of-state adoptions that may be different than in-state, and all kind of preferences that we'll want to deal with. But where do we kind of get started?
Now, in all seriousness, the first thing to do is make the phone call, okay? Because there are lots of different approaches. If you are a birth mom, there's a lot of scary stuff going on, a lot of concerns, some of which are real, some of which are imagined, but all of us as humans work on our perceptions, not on reality. So an imagined fear is just as real to a person as a real fear. So really the first thing to do, whether a couple is trying to adopt or a woman is considering an adoption plan for her unborn baby, is to make the phone call. And at that point, at least in our office, we will sit down with the people and explain the process, explain what their options are, explain how the process works, and take it from there. But in short, start with the birth mother's perspective. The main thing that a woman needs to understand about adoption when she's considering an adoption plan for her baby is that she's not under any obligation to proceed with an adoption by merely talking about it. In fact, under Indiana law, she can't sign a consent to adoption until after the baby's born. So she should not have any reservations at all about asking questions.
So information first before any kind of commitment could be registered, so no one can be nailed into or hammered into that kind of. Well, why don't you introduce Schwartz to us now?
No, actually, it's Rhonda Schwindt.
Rhonda Schwindt.
I was going to bring Rhonda Schwartz, but I couldn't
Rhonda
find
Schwartz, got to find anybody like that. Hi, Rhonda
Schwindt. Yeah, I didn't tell you that. Rhonda Schwartz is not available. This is Rhonda. Rhonda is a woman that I met years ago, and I think it wasn't until recently that she started liking me again, but she can tell you that.
Rhonda, your story.
I guess it was 12 years ago, wasn't it, Steve, that we met. I was just out of nursing school, had just moved to Indianapolis, getting ready to take my state board exams, and discovered that I was pregnant. And at that time wasn't, in the beginning, really clear about what I was going to do, except that I was going to continue with the pregnancy. And as time sort of progressed and moved on, the idea of adoption started to I just started considering it based on the fact that I was newly out of school, not really very settled. And Steve was probably the third or fourth. What I did was exactly what Steve said, is I made a phone call. And I called a couple of adoption agencies and went there and met with people. I met with a private attorney and just simply made that phone call and went in. And just in the beginning, it was just trying to figure out if this really would be a viable option or not. And it was probably 6 months into my pregnancy that I had gotten Steve's name from a colleague at the hospital. And by that time, it was becoming more and more clear to me that that was probably the option that was going to be the best. Not necessarily maybe what was going to be best for me, but I thought what was going to be best for my baby. That I thought I really thought that he really needed a two-parent home.
So you got information, contacted an attorney,
right,
recognized that this was clearly an option that was of interest to you, so you got the information, right, and we're going to talk more about that process right after the information and the commitment, and the process ultimately to find a home for the child. We'll do that right after these important news. Welcome back to UPN Focus. We've been talking with Steve Kirsh and Rhonda Schwindt about the adoption process. Steve, an adoption lawyer, Rhonda, birth mother. She was telling us before we left after the first segment that a pregnancy and options that she was looking at that time in her life, and she then located an adoption lawyer. What happened after that?
Well, interrupt for just a second.
Please do.
Because I want to make it, it needs to be clear that Rhonda looked at all of her options, I mean, in terms of adoption, before deciding to work with me. And I think it's important to understand that you have to, in this process, find someone with whom you're comfortable. If a birth mom doesn't trust the adoption attorney or the adoption agency, or if the adoptive parents don't feel comfortable with the attorney or the agency, they really need to find someone else. And I know there's lots of people that work with me or met me that think, yeah, we're just not going to work with him. And there's other people that feel differently.
That's true. Good feel about working with anyone. Think about the most intimate things about your life, and to entrust it to a professional. Clearly, you'd want to have to repose some comfort level in that.
And the key word is trust.
Right.
You absolutely have to have unconditional trust in the person who's making this arrangement. Go ahead.
Keep going here, Ron. Tell us about this.
Well, I think Steve brings up a good point. I mean, I had certainly explored a lot of different options. And I think it's also important to emphasize, for the sake, I think, of all birth mothers, that it's not something that you just wake up one day and say, oh, I think I won't parent my baby. I mean, it's something that is a very deep, painful, and a lot of soul searching that takes place. And part of that, there also is a practical side to that, that you do have to make some plans, or hopefully you make some plans ahead of time. By the time I met Steve, I had met other individuals, and I just had not found the right place yet. The agencies were very good, and I'm sure would have done a fine job with the adoption, but it just lacked that personal touch that I felt like I needed. I met with other attorneys, and that didn't seem to do it. And finally, when I met with Steve, I knew almost immediately that if I were going to proceed with the adoption, that one, I wanted to do it with an attorney, and that attorney would be Steve if I did, in fact, follow through with my plan. And I think it was the idea of that I wasn't dealing with an agency, I was dealing with
an individual. One person,
right. One individual. And you do have to put an awful lot of trust, sort of, and to some extent, blind trust into that person.
So you've got some confidentiality issues,
exactly.
Issues about your own values relative to the parenting things, and so you've really got to kind of spill your soul, if you will.
Exactly.
So clearly, that trust element is one that's is a top and high priority.
And you have to do it in a way that you know you're not going to be judged for it, because the women with whom I work already feel bad enough about their circumstance. They don't need anyone to make them feel worse about it.
Has the stigma syndrome lessened through the years of your practice, Steve, or is it still an undercurrent that's out there that you've got to work a lot through before you even get into finding an adoptive home?
Well, Rhonda can answer this probably as well as I can, but I think there's still a lot of negative feelings about adoption. I think that you could get fully half of the population of the United States to argue forcefully that abortion is okay. I think you get, I think people would fight you on that. I don't know that you could get half the population to say that adoption is okay.
That's very interesting. You
I agree. I do, and I think there still is a stigma attached. I certainly think there was 12 years ago when I made the decision. There was more stigma attached and more judging done about my wanting and then eventually making an adoption plan than there was the fact of the pregnancy in and of itself. That didn't seem to be the issue. The issue was that I was not going to parent my child. And I think that a lot of that is that the way the media portrays adoption. I mean, birth mothers tend to be portrayed not in a very positive light. And, nobody wants to watch a made-for-TV movie about a positive adoption experience. They're going to watch the one about the one birth mother out of a million who shows up at kids' school 10 years later. Or they don't look at it in a way that this is a really positive thing. It's sort of that old pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You got yourself pregnant, so deal with it. And deal with it means parent that baby. And when you say, I can't do that,
it may not be the most responsible choice.
May not be.
For in the best interest of that
absolutely.
child. So I can see where we can get by that negative circumstance, particularly in your own case, and now you've moved forward. And do you have a lot of choice in where the home for that child?
I certainly do think that birth mothers today do. And it certainly varies state by state, and Steve is certainly the expert on that. At the time that I made the adoption plan in the state of Indiana, there weren't it was not as open as later I had wished that it had been. But I was able, with Steve, I basically had an idea in mind of what I wanted. And what it really came down to is I wanted my son, Zach, to have the same kind of parents that I hoped to be someday. I mean, I wanted him to have all the things that I hoped at a later time in my life I could offer a child, and that is a father, was very important to me, and a couple that could provide for him what I just wasn't capable of doing as a single parent at that time. And to go back to the stigma, part of that too that I suffered from was that people see things sometimes as when you make a choice for something, they see it as making a choice against something.
And that's not necessarily.
And it wasn't about single parenthood. I was not making a decision about whether that was good or bad. It was about what I was capable of doing. And so with Steve's help, I was really able, I think, to identify what was important to me, you know, what I wanted in a couple. And I did have the opportunity to speak with them. We communicated several times during the last part of the pregnancy through letters, and they sent me all kinds of information, non-identifying information, but you know, their professions, what their interests were. It was real important to me that I hear from the father, and particularly since I was having a boy, and I thought that was particularly important. And he wrote me letters about what his plans were for Zach. So I knew that if in fact,
some choice and some input
definitely
into the process.
And then we are in the realm of adoption. Things have changed significantly in the last 20 years. Oh. I mean, it's almost the same way computers have changed in the last 20 years. That's
dramatic a change.
Exactly. 20 years ago, when I first started doing this, actually before that, the typical situation was that a woman who was pregnant would go to an adoption agency, and the adoption agency would decide where that child went. The birth mother would have no input. She wouldn't know anything about where the child went. She wouldn't have any updates. She wouldn't have any say in the selection process. And that just wasn't working out well. In fact, there were a lot of older birth moms, who were really felt like they were the victims of the process because they didn't have any control over it. Well, things started changing primarily because of the advent of private adoption. Mm-hmm. When the attorneys got involved, they saw that we don't have to do it the way they did it 100 years ago.
We can experiment with more creative ways of making matches. And that's really what it is it not a matching process, finding an expectant family with an expected child and then making the best match that you possibly can. From the perspective of the expectant parents, their entry process, do they just call you up and say, we're interested in a child of certain characteristics and find me one?
Did I mention my phone number?
Yeah, we mentioned your phone number, and we'll do it again.
They call. And yes, we talk to them. We find out what their interests are, what their hopes, desires are, etc. The matching is not like it was 20 and 50 years ago. It's no longer matching in the sense that we want the child to look like the adoptive parents, which was a lot of the way it was years ago.
But other characteristics that we're going to talk about right after these important words from our special sponsors. We'll be right back. Welcome back to UPN Focus. We've been talking about adoption with adoption lawyer Steve Kirsh and birth mother Rhonda Schwindt. Tell me a little bit more about this matching process.
Yeah, the matching process, adoptive parents generally come in and their requests are pretty fundamental. Newborn or an older child, race of the child. Beyond that, health of the child. I mean, once a family knows that, then there's not a lot of matching that's done from their point of view. Most of the matching comes in from the birth mom's point of view. There are 80 to 100 families nationally for every baby for adoption. Okay? So a birth mom has a lot of choices over the type of family that's going to adopt. And I think in order for any woman to proceed with an adoption, 3 things have to be true. We mentioned the first one. She has to trust the person making the arrangements. Secondly, she has to come to terms with the idea of adoption. And thirdly, she has to be comfortable with the family that's going to adopt. Or to say it differently, if she was accepting of the idea of adoption but thought her child would be mistreated, she'd never agree to an adoption. And likewise, if she loved the family to death but never came to terms with the idea, she'd never proceed. So from the birth mom's perspective, there are some birth moms that are very particular about the family that's going to adopt in terms of their age, occupation, religion, whether or not they have other children, a stay-at-home mom. I even had a birth mom once who wanted a family with red hair. I mean, there are, now obviously that is not as important as others, but that was important to her.
Right.
So we find out from the birth mom what type of family she's interested in having, and then we try to find adoptive parents who have all, if not, or some, if not all of those attributes. Okay? And that's really the first level. If a birth mom is only interested in adopting or having a redheaded family adopt her baby, then there's no point in having her consider families who...
Because of this heavy-handed supply and demand difference, we now hear of adoptions that are international in nature and a great deal of activity around cross-racial, cross-ethnic kinds of adoptions. Is that a trend that's likely to continue, or do you see that stemming? And we're getting close to running out of time here, but kind of answer that in a nutshell for me, Steve, if you can.
I think it's a different concept. People generally adopt internationally for one of two reasons. One is they want to save a child, because there are children out there who are desperately in need of homes, and secondly, they're scared to death of a birth parent taking the child away from them, which is an unrealistic fear in Indiana. If
you were to summarize the process in less than a minute, tell us, Steve, what would folks out here do if they were very interested in adoption?
Let me just, before I do that, because this is really important, the biggest misconception about adoption in our country is that birth mothers, women who are pregnant, proceed with adoptions because they don't want their babies, because they don't care about their babies, because they don't want them. Our society, if it knows nothing else about adoption, needs to understand that women like Rhonda are heroes. They do the most unselfish, courageous thing imaginable to provide for their child in a way that they don't feel like they can provide. And I know there's been a lot of kidding around in this program, but if people will understand that and have the respect that women like Rhonda deserve, I think it's going to be a lot better for everyone.
Well, they'll listen to you and they'll call your number just like they're going to listen to this week's community calendar.
With the holidays behind us, here are some events in our area for you to focus on. Get out your calendar and save this date. Tickets for the American Cancer Society Breast Cancer Awareness Fashion Show are on sale now. This event always sells out early, so get your tickets today. Winning with Strides will take place at the Westin Hotel on March 30th. The goal of the fashion show is to educate women and men on the importance of early detection. And Families Through International Adoption is presenting an informal seminar today at St. Luke's United Methodist Church. FTIA is a nonprofit adoption agency in Indianapolis for families interested in adoption. Call for more details. And the Indiana Broadcasters Association would like you to know about a career fest at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer. There will be several broadcast stations with openings in the exciting world of broadcasting, participating in the January 23rd event, which is sponsored in part by the IBA and UPN 23. We want to hear from you. Send your event information 3 weeks in advance to be part of the UPN 23 community calendar.
And I know you'll take advantage of those wonderful opportunities right here in our community. I want to thank our special guest, Rhonda Schwindt, and my good friend Steve Kirsh, adoption lawyer. I know if you're interested in adoption, in that entire subject matter, you'll call his number. We'll see you right here this time next week on UPN Focus.